The shrill cry tore through the stillness of the forest like a jagged blade. Harold froze mid-step, instinct taking over. That cry, it wasn't from a deer or a fox. It was raw, sharp, desperate. He turned toward the sound, boots crunching over the frosted underbrush, his breath clouding in the cold air. The old ranger hadn't intended to stray this far from his usual route, but something about today, something unexplainable, had drawn him deeper into the forest. 10 minutes later, he found the source. There, wedged awkwardly beneath a fallen pine branch and half covered in snow, was a grizzly cub, no more than 8 months old. Its hind leg was twisted in a rusted steel-jaw trap, blood staining the snow a deep, terrifying red. The cub whimpered again, barely able to move. Harold could see it was losing the will to fight. He dropped to his knees. "No sudden moves," he murmured to himself, voice calm and low. "You're okay, little one. I'm not going to hurt you." The cub growled faintly but didn't lunge. It was in too much pain. Harold's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He knew protocol. He was supposed to call it in, wait for the wildlife officers to arrive. They'd take one look and put the cub down. Injured wild animals weren't a priority to the department. They were liabilities. But something inside him, some deep, dormant place, rebelled at the thought. He pulled out his multi-tool, braced the trap, and pried it open with a grunt. The bear let out a pained roar, weak but heart-wrenching, and collapsed. The damage was brutal. Flesh torn, bone likely fractured. It wouldn't survive the night alone. And so Harold did the unthinkable. He took off his thick jacket, gently swaddled the cub inside it, and lifted him into his arms. The bear was heavier than expected, but Harold pushed through the pain. The storm was coming in fast. He didn't look back as he trudged toward home. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall spruce trees, their tips already heavy with snow. Inside, it smelled like pine sap and coffee, and the wood stove glowed warm against the evening dark. He laid the cub on a thick rug near the fire, muttering soothing words as he cleaned the wound with boiled water and antiseptic. The bear growled faintly at the sting, but didn't fight him. There was a flicker of something else in its eyes. Confusion, maybe, or fear, or both. That night, Harold barely slept. He checked the bear every hour, feeding it bits of soaked bread and water with a ladle. When morning came and the bear was still breathing, he allowed himself a breath of relief. "I guess you need a name," he said aloud. The bear blinked slowly. "How about Milo?" The cub snorted softly, then closed its eyes again. Milo's recovery wasn't fast, but it was steady. Days turned into weeks, and Harold's days found new rhythm. He crushed wild berries for nutrition, massaged the bear's injured leg, and took brief walks with Milo leaning against him for support. At first, the cub limped in slow circles around the cabin. Eventually, he began to roam farther, always within sight. Harold, who had lived in solitude for the better part of 3 decades, found his world shifting. Mornings were no longer silent. They were filled with soft snorts, paws thudding across wooden floors, and the low rumble of Milo's breath as he slept near the hearth. Evenings were spent watching the snowfall together, Milo's massive head sometimes resting against Harold's knee. The transformation wasn't just in the bear. Harold himself began to change. He laughed again, for the first time in years, when Milo knocked over his stack of firewood. He spoke more, even if only to the bear. He hummed old tunes he hadn't thought of in decades. The weight of his loneliness, the slow, invisible burden he'd carried for years, lifted with every passing day. Milo, for his part, became a mirror of Harold. Gentle, calm, attentive. He learned boundaries. He never growled at Harold, never struck out. As he grew larger, he remained astonishingly careful with his strength. His eyes followed Harold wherever he went, and when Harold sat down, Milo would often lie at his feet with a huff of contentment. But the world beyond the cabin wasn't blind. Word spread in nearby towns. A hunter claimed he saw a bear walk calmly past his truck without flinching. A mailman spotted large paw prints near Harold's cabin, accompanied by oddly human-like trails, like someone had walked with the bear. "Something's up with that old ranger," they whispered in diners and bait shops. "That bear's too tame." Harold ignored the rumors until one day a knock came at the cabin door. 3 men stood outside, forestry department badges glinting beneath heavy coats. "Routine inspection," one said curtly. Harold's heart thundered in his chest. Milo was out back, resting beneath the brush pile near the ridge. Harold had told him to stay hidden when the strange cars arrived. He hoped the bear had listened. The inspectors poked around, took notes, asked questions. Harold played the role of grumpy recluse to perfection, tight-lipped, suspicious, and unhelpful. "Seen any wildlife close to home lately?" one asked. Harold shrugged. "Owls, deer, the usual." "Any bears?" "Not since spring." They didn't find anything. As they left, one of them glanced back at the tree line. "You ever see something unusual, Harold?" he said. "Make sure you let us know." Harold just nodded. That night, he didn't sleep. Milo didn't return. The next morning, Harold walked to the ridge behind his house. He found Milo hidden in the trees, exactly where he'd been told to stay. The bear stood when he saw Harold, making a low rumble of greeting. Harold knelt in front of him. "You did good, boy." Milo pressed his forehead gently to Harold's chest. Still, Harold knew things were different now. The world had gotten closer. The eyes were watching. Sooner or later, someone would come looking harder. That evening, as snowflakes began to fall in thick clusters, Harold opened the cabin door to find Milo sitting outside. The bear had returned on his own, silent, solemn, unmoving. "You shouldn't be here," Harold whispered. Milo didn't budge. "You have to go back, just for now, until it's safe." Still, the bear remained, his coat speckled with snow, eyes fixed on the man who had saved him. Harold stepped forward, placing a hand on the thick fur between Milo's ears. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly, "promise you won't forget me." Milo stared at him unblinking, and then slowly, deliberately, lowered himself onto the porch, curling up like he used to. Snow fell around them in silence. The only sound was the fire crackling inside and the wind sighing through the pines. Inside that stillness, a promise was made, one that no man or beast could break. The snow came heavy that night. Harold hadn't mentioned the chest pains to anyone. Not that there was anyone to tell, save for Ellie 2 cabins down, a retired schoolteacher who occasionally left soup on his doorstep. He'd chalked it up to the cold, maybe a flu coming on. But the truth had been quietly growing inside him for years, a slow and silent corrosion. It happened early in the morning, while he was chopping firewood behind the cabin. One moment he was raising the axe, the next he was on the ground, mouth open, eyes staring at a sky that had gone pale and distant. Milo wasn't there to see it. He'd stayed farther into the forest since the inspection, keeping his distance as Harold asked. But that day, something changed. The wind shifted, and the bear stilled. The next day, Ellie noticed Harold hadn't collected the soup she left on his porch. She waited until evening, still untouched. On the 3rd morning, she knocked. No answer. The fire inside had gone cold. A strange dread prickled along her spine as she stepped around back and saw him, face down, skin like wax, axe lying beside him in the snow. She called the sheriff, who called an ambulance, but it was all routine formality. The paramedics took one look and shook their heads. They found a note in Harold's coat pocket. Not a will, just a line scribbled on a napkin in his shaky handwriting. "In case something happens, let the bear be." At the hospital, machines beeped softly. Tubes ran like tangled ivy from Harold's arms, but he was already slipping away, drifting between memories. Sometimes he'd murmur Milo's name. Sometimes he smiled, faintly, as if dreaming of a cabin filled with warmth. He never woke again. A week later, just past sunrise, he exhaled for the last time. There were no family members listed in the hospital system, no emergency contacts. The only person who came when they called was Ellie. "I'll take care of the arrangements," she said quietly, her voice trembling. He didn't have many people, but he mattered. Deep in the forest, Milo stirred. The air felt heavier, the light thinner. He hadn't returned to the cabin in days, but now something was pulling him. A stillness in the trees, an ache he couldn't explain. He trudged through the snow, paws leaving massive, deliberate prints until he reached the clearing. The cabin was dark. The chimney was cold. Milo padded to the porch, sniffing the doorframe. He nudged it open with a powerful shoulder, stepping into the quiet gloom. Everything smelled like Harold. He found the coat draped on a chair and buried his face in it, inhaling deeply. Then he lay down, paws curled under him, like he had 100 times before. But Harold wasn't coming back. That night, Milo refused to eat. The next morning, he wandered into the woods again, retracing the paths they used to walk. He lingered by the old log where Harold would sit and whistle. He stopped by the creek where they once splashed in the summer. Again and again he returned to the porch. Waiting. Ellie stood at the counter in the town's only funeral home, reviewing the modest arrangements she could afford. A basic wooden casket, a headstone with Harold's name and a single inscription. He lived with quiet honor. No flowers, no music, just a short graveside service under a gray winter sky. She didn't expect anyone to come. Later that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the funeral card in her hand. A knock rattled the door. It was Frank, the mailman, holding out his phone. "You're not gonna believe this." On the screen was a photo taken just that morning. A grizzly bear, huge, unmistakable, standing on the edge of Highway 12. Behind him, just visible in the frame, was the town cemetery's sign. "I took that on my route," Frank said. He didn't move, just stood there looking sad. The photo went viral within hours. Local news picked it up. "Grizzly appears near cemetery ahead of man's funeral. Coincidence?" Online forums exploded with theories. Some mocked it, some called it spiritual. Others feared the bear might be dangerous. Officials from the wildlife department were less sentimental. "We need to find this animal," said one. "Track it, relocate it if possible. Worst case, tranquilize." "But the bear hasn't harmed anyone," Ellie argued when she heard. "He's mourning. Let him mourn." The debate simmered, but the bear had already vanished back into the forest. For 2 days, no one saw him. No fresh tracks, no sightings, just cold wind and heavy skies. The day of the funeral arrived. Snow fell in delicate flurries, soft as ash. Ellie arrived first. She wore her best black coat, the hem too short for the weather, and carried a single white rose. Behind her came 2 forest rangers, hats in hand. Then a third man, a stranger, stood by the gate for a long time before stepping in. He looked like Harold. Sharper jawline, darker hair gone silver. "I'm his brother," he told Ellie quietly. "We hadn't spoken in years. Thought I'd missed my chance." They stood in silence beside the closed casket, waiting. The pastor began to speak. Harold was a man of solitude, but not of absence. He gave more than he asked for. He saved lives, walked the woods with reverence, and... A rustling sound broke the hush. At the edge of the cemetery, where the trees met the snow-covered field, a massive shape appeared. Gasps rose from the group. One of the rangers instinctively reached for the tranquilizer on his belt, but Ellie grabbed his arm. "No." Out of the trees came Milo. He didn't roar, didn't run, just walked, slowly, powerfully toward the gathering, snow clinging to his thick fur. The people parted as he approached, some backing away in awe, others frozen in disbelief. Milo stepped up to the casket and stopped. Then he sat, head bowed, breathing steady, silent. Ellie wept. The rangers lowered their hands. Even Harold's brother said nothing, just stared, the wind lifting tears from his eyes. And there, beneath the gray sky and falling snow, a bear kept vigil for a man the world barely noticed, but whom he had loved beyond words. No one moved. The bear stood beside Harold's coffin, massive and still, his breath curling into the cold air in long, steady clouds. The quiet of the cemetery was absolute. So deep, even the wind seemed to pause. Then Milo stepped forward. One heavy paw after another sank gently into the snow as he approached the wooden box that held his only friend. The casket was simple, but Milo treated it like sacred ground. He stopped inches away, his snout hovering just over the polished lid. And then he did something no one could explain. He lay down. He, not as a wild animal rests, alert and ready to flee, but as one in mourning, slowly, deliberately, folding his legs beneath him, then lowering his massive head until it touched the casket. His nose pressed softly against the wood. A long, low sound escaped his throat. A mournful rumble, not angry, not wild, but filled with something ancient and aching. Ellie gasped. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's saying goodbye." The rangers stared, paralyzed. One took an uncertain step forward, but the other stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Wait. Just wait." For over 20 minutes, Milo didn't move. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing his broad back and Harold's casket alike. The only sounds were Ellie's quiet sobs and the wind shifting through the distant pines. Someone raised their phone and began to record. Others followed, uncertain at first, then overwhelmed by the surreal beauty of what they were witnessing. A bear, grieving a man, not threatening, not wild, just mourning. The video hit social media before the service even ended. By sunset, it had already been shared across thousands of accounts. Within hours, it had gone viral worldwide. Bear mourns his rescuer in unbelievable funeral scene. Proof of animal grief? The internet says yes. Milo and Harold, the bond that death couldn't break. Back at the cemetery, Ellie stood a few steps behind the bear. Her breath fogged in front of her face, her eyes rimmed red. She cleared her throat. "I need to say something," she said quietly, stepping beside the coffin, facing the others, and Milo. "If you'll let me." Everyone turned toward her, even the rangers. She looked down at the bear and then at the sky. Harold never had a family, at least not one who stayed. I only met him by chance. He fixed my fence once, and after that, we'd talk. Not often, but when he rescued that cub— She paused, her voice tightening. When he found Milo, he didn't see a threat. He saw a creature in pain, alone, just like he was, and he gave everything he had to save him. Every day, even when he could barely carry firewood, he'd make sure that Bear had food, had care, had company. Her eyes flicked down to Milo again. And you know what? I think Milo gave him something back. Gave him peace, a reason to wake up in the morning. Silence. Someone sniffled. He wasn't just a bear to Harold. He was his heart. The ranger who had wanted to intervene now quietly wiped at his face. Even Harold's estranged brother lowered his eyes, ashamed that it took death and a bear to show him what kind of man Harold really was. Eventually, the ceremony had to end. The pastor closed his book, the final prayers were said, and the last handful of dirt scattered across the snow-covered casket. One ranger slowly stepped forward. "Ellie, we have to try to move him. It's getting late." She nodded, though her eyes stayed locked on Milo. "Just do it gently, please." The ranger approached cautiously, speaking in low, calming tones. He extended a hand, though it trembled slightly. "Milo," he said softly, "it's time to go, big guy. Come on now." The bear didn't growl, didn't flinch, but he didn't move either. Another ranger stepped closer, readying a long pole, non-lethal just in case. Ellie moved between them. "No poles," she snapped. "Talk to him. That's what Harold would have done." And so, they tried again. "Milo, we know. We're sorry, but you can't stay here forever." After a few more moments, Milo exhaled, a long breath, almost like a sigh. Then he lifted his massive head from the coffin. He stood slowly, carefully, as if the very act of moving away hurt him. The snow on his back cascaded to the ground. His nose touched the wood once more. A nuzzle. A final farewell. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back toward the forest. No one spoke until Milo's figure disappeared behind the trees. Even then, it took time before they could move again. Ellie was the last to leave, brushing her hand across the top of the casket one final time. "Thank you, Harold," she whispered, "for showing us what love can look like." Milo didn't return to the cabin. Not that night. Not the next. For days, the woods were quiet. Rangers patrolled gently, searching, but the bear seemed to have vanished into the winter. Ellie returned to the cabin twice to check, but nothing was touched. Harold's coat still lay where Milo had curled up days before. And the world watched. News anchors debated it. Animal experts were called to weigh in. Was the bear really grieving? Is this emotional intelligence or conditioned behavior? Have we underestimated what these creatures are capable of? Some scoffed. Most were stunned. Others simply cried. One comment under the viral video summed up what millions felt. That bear mourned better than most people know how to. He didn't need to speak to say everything that mattered. Somewhere out there, in the deep folds of forest where no camera could follow, Milo moved with the quiet of snow. He didn't return to the places he and Harold once shared. Not yet. Instead, he wandered, alone. But the world had seen what he did, and no one would ever forget the bear who said goodbye. The story refused to fade. By the next morning, Milo's vigil at the funeral had become more than just a viral moment. It had become a symbol. Television networks ran the clip on loop, international news stations picked it up, and headlines lit up the internet like wildfire. The bear that grieved. One last goodbye. A wild animal's love. The bear who sat in silence. Talk show hosts teared up on camera. Scientists debated whether Milo's actions constituted true grief. And everywhere, online forums, comment sections, classrooms, even dinner tables, people were asking the same question. Can animals love? Ellie didn't answer that question with science. She answered it with a memory. She sat at Harold's old cabin one late afternoon, journal open on her lap, the fire crackling beside her. Snow still clung to the trees, but spring teased in the distance. She wrote slowly, deliberately, each word a quiet offering to a man and a bear who had changed her forever. "Harold once told me," she wrote, "I don't think animals forget kindness. Not really. They carry it somewhere just like we do." She paused, letting the ink dry. "I believe him now, and I think the world does too." Within weeks, something strange and beautiful began to happen. People started showing up. At first, it was just one or two. A young couple who had driven hours to see the cabin. A woman from across the state who had lost her dog and said the story helped her grieve. They didn't come empty-handed. They brought hand-carved bears, bundles of flowers, drawings, children's letters, and wood-burned signs etched with words like, "Thank you, Harold," and "For Milo," who didn't forget. Soon, there were dozens. The footpath to Harold's cabin became a trail of tribute. Beneath the old pine tree where Milo had once waited in the snow, someone planted a wooden cross. At its base sat a small plaque that read, "To the man who saw a soul in a wounded beast," and the bear who remembered. Ellie stood in that clearing one morning, overwhelmed. She turned in slow circles, taking in the tokens left behind. Each one told its own story. A crocheted scarf, a painted stone, a child's crayon drawing of a bear hugging a man. The world had grieved with Milo, and now it wanted to honor him. That was the day Ellie decided the story wouldn't end here. She opened a folder she'd been carrying for weeks, a plan she'd quietly developed with the help of a few local conservationists. The Milo Sanctuary, a haven for injured wildlife, a safe place for orphaned cubs, wounded animals, and misunderstood creatures who needed not just healing, but dignity. Funded through donations sparked by the viral story, it grew rapidly from an idea into a blueprint and then into something real. Land was secured near the edge of the forest where Milo had once roamed. Volunteers poured in, and in its founding charter, written in Ellie's careful hand, were these words: "We honor those who show kindness not for reward, but because it is right. This sanctuary exists because one man didn't turn away, and one bear never forgot." Milo was not seen for some time. The forest rangers kept their distance. The town, once nervous, had changed its tone completely. When a bear was spotted near the road 2 months later, it wasn't met with panic. It was met with hope. A shaky photo was taken from a distance, a massive grizzly sitting quietly by the riverbank. No one dared approach. But Ellie knew. He had returned to one of his old haunts, the place where he and Harold used to fish. She smiled when she saw the image. He remembers. As the seasons turned, the sanctuary came alive. Injured animals arrived weekly, rescued by new rangers trained in humane care. A special area was reserved for bear cubs, and Ellie made sure a wooden carving of Milo stood watch over them. Visitors came not just to see the animals, but to hear the story. And Ellie told it often, at fundraisers, at schools, at forest education events. Not for attention, but because it mattered. Because the bond between Harold and Milo had reminded people of something timeless: empathy, trust, loyalty, not just between humans, but across species. It was a story that made the world stop, even if only for a moment. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. On the first anniversary of Harold's death, Ellie returned to the cabin. It was a quiet morning, cold, clear, and still. The path was mostly empty now, just a few new offerings left near the cross. She carried a framed photo under her arm. In it, Harold, seated on a log, smiling faintly. Beside him, Milo as a cub, one massive paw on the man's knee. She stepped into the clearing and froze. Milo was there, larger now, still powerful, but not wild in the way most people would expect. He was sitting, right beside the wooden cross, his head slightly bowed, as if listening to something far away. When he heard her approach, he didn't bolt. He didn't growl. He looked at her, and in his eyes Ellie saw something that felt like recognition. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Milo stood, turned, and began to walk slowly back toward the tree line. He paused once, just before vanishing between the trees, and looked back, not as a threat, not as a wild thing, but like a guardian returning to his post. Ellie stood alone for a moment, holding the photograph to her chest. Then she walked to the cabin door and gently nailed it in place. Harold and Milo, side by side. The wind blew softly, rustling the trees, and the forest remembered them both.